Hello, everyone. My name is Breanna Shanahan. I am the instructor for Daily Art Practice, which is a course here in an 8-week course that's happening virtually with Pointe-Saint-Charles Art School. I'm making this video just for those of you who were not able to attend the first day. I know there were a lot of conflicts or who had to leave partway through for meetings. And this is just so that you can see sort of the presentation as to how this course came to be, a little bit behind the ideas that are being shared in this course, and some relevant examples that might help you to sort of get in the frame of mind for how we will be running these next 7 weeks. So this is just a recap, and it'll introduce you a little bit to what we're going to be doing at the beginning of each class, although each class will be distinct and different. So I'll get right into that. I'm just going to share my screen. Here we are. Okay, so present. Welcome to Daily Art Practice. This is a course that I'm very excited to be teaching, primarily because it's such a huge part of my personal art practice, and a kind of solve or attempt to help with a problem that I think many artists face when in the studio, that of needing some new ideas or some outlets to start to restructure, rethink, see your practice with new eyes. Or to get out of artist funk, which sometimes we get into. Sometimes we see an idea to the end and then we look at new ideas and we're like, is this even worth starting? You look back at how much you've made before and it feels maybe hard to start on a new idea. But I think that by involving play and exercises that help you to sort of create things that you don't expect or try novel ways of coming up with ideas, you can really start to enjoy your practice as, reignite that passion for it and enjoy some of the novel things that come out of it. So daily art practice really became a big part of my personal art practice when COVID hit. Primarily, I had been working in large-scale installation sculpture. My studio at the time was shut down. I was no longer able to go there. It was difficult to get materials. There was the curfew for some time. So, that's the prime time for working in the studio. I found for myself was late at night and after 8. And this whole idea of having to be back at home, shutting down that space was very, very difficult, and started to really impress on me, like, well, what is my practice if I'm not in the space where I can make these large scale sculptural works? I had always really loved drawing, and I'd always really loved watercoloring. And an old studio mate buddy of mine, who you might know, Dave LaRue, he teaches some courses here as well. He and I started talking about, can we meet? Can we make work while we're online together? It started from that and then kind of developed with a few other friends. It became a way to sort of fight isolation. Coping with COVID was really fighting that isolation feeling of being stuck at home, being home, worrying and being concerned about what was happening outside of your doors. And how do we make work in that period of time? So I know, like probably most of you, or maybe I assume that most of you might have started to feel the same way of kind of melting in, becoming part of the house, really being stuck within that sort of 4 walls and ping-ponging back and forth. At a certain point, I was teaching at Mount Allison University in New Brunswick, and because my partner and I were traveling to and from the Atlantic bubble, we had to quarantine. So in the end, I think we did 3 separate periods of quarantine, so 14 days each. We could not leave the 4 corners of our property. We were allowed to walk around the house though, so that was nice in the fall, to be able to walk several times around the house to sort of be able to stretch it out. But there was this sort of anxiety feeling of being stuck inside, and a desire from an artistic perspective to somehow document or bookmark this moment, which I felt was quite unique. And so watercolor was a really quick, easy way of doing that. When we finally were able to start walking outside again, we couldn't really interact with too many people. Like, things were really shut down at the time. So there was a lot of nature walks, and I started to feel this sort of like feeling of being a houseplant or being stuck inside, or desiring that outdoor, beautiful, lush green. So these started to come out in little examples of watercolor pieces. At the time, I was no longer able to be part of the Montreal Drawing Club, Le Club de Dessin de Montréal, which was a group that I had joined a few years prior and was really happy to be a part of. It was started by a curator in Montreal who basically wanted to take a bunch of contemporary artists, curators, writers, thinkers, and have them all get together once every 2 weeks on a Thursday night. We would often meet in someone's studio or in a park, and we would just draw together and we would riff off of each other. We would maybe have a theme. We would draw off of old drawings or draw drawings on other people's drawings. And we ended up having a show for real by accident, un an plus tard, Le Club de Dessin, a year after we sort of had all formed. And it was just wonderful, exciting, different work. And, you know, this was a kind of community organization that was sort of just a side pastime, but something that I really missed. Sadie, Sadie, go, 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 go. I know, I love you, go. So Jonathan Borofsky is an artist, and he does a really interesting particular thing with his practice where he actually will number every single piece he has ever done, whether it be a small doodle, which here you can see is number 2,660,200, made in 1980, or a large installation sculpture, public sculpture, 2,714,830. So it's a really interesting practice to sort of elevate every single creation to be a numbered creation, whether it be a doodle or a full scale work or something in between. And you can definitely see works of his. You might have recognized some of these pieces from installations that he has across Canada. But it wasn't just me who was impressed with this. Of course, Ed Pien, who is an amazing drawing artist from Montreal. He actually did a semester teaching at Concordia University as a guest professor. He was really enamored by this idea of, wow, what is it to make 3 million artworks and like to really quantify that kind of art making? So he thought to himself, okay, how can I make that many artworks? What would I have to do? And so he calculated, he's like, all right, if I do one painting every 3 minutes, you know, however many hours every day for however many years it takes, it's going to take me something like 20 years to catch up to that. And so there's this real like sort of industrial process of just producing that he created this initial series, this 3-minute painting series with. And so he would work with this sort of 3-minute model. And what he found coming out of it was this kind of subconscious conversation. So when you have just 3 minutes, that 3 minutes goes by, the timer goes off, you have to move on to something else. And so a lot of discussions about his sexuality, about his personal life, like sort of psychoanalyzing the day, bookmarking the time, all of these things were coming out in these 3-minute gestures when you're sort of desperate for an idea. And it was a really interesting meditation process and something that he continued to do. So although each drawing is quite simple, you can see that as a collection, they create a really interesting narrative and conversation around the mind. And something else I want to point out with the paper that he was using, like you can see in this left side, like that paper is actually absorbing that water material. It's absorbing that watercolor, and the wrinkles are kind of pushing towards the center of the piece. It's really emphasizing the piece. So there's something beautiful about that kind of cheaper paper material and what it does to that drawing to really emphasize it. So much in the way that Ed Pien was inspired by Jonathan Borofsky, I was very inspired by Ed Pien, and proposed with some friends to do this kind of virtual 3-minute drawing series and to see what would come out of it. And what we did, instead of sort of working in isolation, is we would have a Zoom call. We would have 10 sheets of paper ready to go. And then every 3 minutes, we would create a drawing. And, you know, we would allow the conversation to go as it would. Sometimes the conversation led to the drawing. Sometimes something we thought about in the day led to the drawing. Sometimes playing just with the material and the tool that we had that day would lead to specific drawings. And what we found was we were creating this really wonderful vocabulary of line and mark and imagery that sort of sat on the wall. Like you can see, it's all taped up here. I kind of put it on the wall, would think about it on and off, and meet with this group semi-regularly and continue to grow that sort of visual vocabulary. Now I kind of transferred my theme from these singular drawings on separate sheets of paper. I was interested in doing several drawings and having them kind of be in this existence of the paper. And instead of having them as separate 10 images, it was one piece of paper that sort of bookmarked a specific time. So we would go through that 30-minute session, and the conversation would lead to things, experimentation in the moment would lead to things. And it was really interesting to look at it afterwards. More than that, I was kind of thinking about, well, I spent 3 minutes, but why am I just limiting it to 3 minutes? I liked that random things would come from those 3-minute drawings or those 3-minute paintings, but what happens if I spend more time? What happens if I dive back into that piece? So then I developed it into 10-minute drawings, and these 10-minute drawings came out in a few different ways. And then from the 10-minute drawings, it developed even further into much larger scale works. Just one moment. Sadie wants to be part of this video. So some of the vocabulary that was coming out of these different sessions started to really help to feed into larger scale works with like a more solid concept or idea that was happening behind the works. So at the time we were living in this sort of bungalow in New Brunswick for my teaching contract. And it was this beautiful maritime yellow house. And we were really I was really thinking about the property line and this kind of disconnect from strangers and really missing that connection to other people. And this idea of moss and the rhizomatic roots of moss, how they hold on to the rocks, and you have like 80, 100-kilometer winds, but they don't come off, but it's very easy to flick them off with your fingers, this sort of like weak, strong connection that they have. And the moss would grow everywhere in Atlantic Canada. It would grow on fences, on houses, on wooden doors, and it would go underneath the fence lines. And so this piece was called Property Line, and it was really thinking about this connection to the neighbor, to other people, to Montreal, which I missed very much, and sort of contemplating that quarantine period. But more than that, I was using some of these really wonderful trace marks that had been discovered through these 3-minute drawing sessions. So some of these lines had come out in that sort of desperate think of, what do? I only have 3 minutes. Okay, I guess I'll just make these lines. And they started to really feed and enrich the bigger pieces that I was making, which was, when I started to do that, I really started to feel there was something wonderful about this process. So this domino effect of, one little thing from one piece leading to a larger piece, leading to an idea, leading to another piece, started to create a series and a publication that I put into the New Brunswick Created Here, Come From Away magazine. And that was a written work that I titled Proximity to Stranger. And all of these things were sort of festering and growing. And it was because it started from that daily art practice. So this is an example of one of the pieces that I made, a 3-minute piece that actually came from my phone when I was desperate for an idea. And it ended up being transformed into these 2-dimensional pieces that I've been experimenting with plexiglass and using spray paint to emulate the kind of bleedy, beautiful, soft look that watercolor has after it dries. So that was a whole series of works that I did where I took those 3-minute drawings, some sort of ones that I highlighted from this whole year of this series, and was getting them laser cut, sort of creating those files, laser cutting them, and then trying to reimagine that watercolor effect with spray paint. So they were coming into the 3-dimensional world. And I feel even this is not far enough. So it's definitely on its way, but it's work that I'm very excited about right now. And that's some more of it there. Here are some details of the works. So we see this one again. So In my teaching practice, I often focus on the idea of drawing in the expanded field. Right now I'm teaching at NASCAD. I'm teaching a drawing 2 class, so drawing 1500. And it's always something that I work with because it's something that's so important to my personal practice. But I thought we would dive a little bit into what is that? What is drawing in the expanded field? What does it even mean? So Rosalind Krauss, who is an art historian, art critic, incredible author, philosopher, she wrote about sculpture in the expanded field, in which she defined the structural parameters of sculpture, architecture, and landscape art through the precise diagram that I will show you. And Krauss claims that traditional logic of sculpture transformed into something different. Well, I'm sure that in this class, we have a whole range of understanding of art history, so I thought that we would go over it again. If this is repeat knowledge for you, have a seat, enjoy the ride. If not, you can always ask me questions. I'm happy to explain it further. But when we say like the original sculpture ideas, like sculpture had a purpose. Sculpture would depict biblical scenes. It would tell narratives and stories to help people understand it, especially in a time when maybe people couldn't read or literacy was not as elevated as art forms as a way of sharing a message. It's monumental. It tells you of important people or important places of worship, like the Great Sphinx, like Christ the Redeemer. Sometimes it symbolizes a thing. So we can think about the Statue of Liberty, symbolizing liberty. And the Statue of Liberty was a gift from Paris to the States. And it's this sort of symbol of friendship as well, and exchange, which is a really interesting attribute that comes back and really symbolizes that, and then gets used over and over again in different means of media production and visual culture. We know if we see a woman like this with, that kind of crown on her forehead with the fire torch in her hand and a book, we know it means liberty. So it starts to become this sort of signifier for that. But then what do we do with something like this? This is a piece called Spiral Jetty by Robert Smithson in 1970. And it was made in the Great Salt Lake in Utah. And it's a land art piece. So it's using actual land and the sort of salty water, ground, earth to create this form. But is this a sculpture? So that's the form when the water was drying out or in low tide. And we see this kind of come up in this period of time where people were sort of experimenting with, well, what is sculpture? How can I push the boundary of what sculpture is? So we look at this piece by Marcel Duchamp called Fountain. And Marcel Duchamp really championed this idea of the ready-made. Although there is some scrutiny as to whether or not this actually was his piece. And actually there's articles coming out now saying that he took that piece from another artist, a female artist. But for example, with the bottle rack, he put it in an art gallery. He said, okay, here's a bottle rack. That's exactly how it looks. You would buy it like that. But he said, but because I'm an artist and because I selected this as an interesting form, it's already made. It's a ready-made art object. And so sculpture was starting to take on all of these different kind of things. Like it was no longer about hyperrealism or the craftsmanship of the sculptor to create this sort of image of a human figure doing something, acting something, or representing something. It started to become much more conceptual. And so this was the diagram that Rosalind Krauss proposed, saying, sculpture is landscape or not landscape? Is it architecture or not architecture? Axiomatic structures, marked sites, site construction. So trying to really understand like all of the different frames and kind of this expanded way of looking at sculpture. So we're in daily art practice. We will not be doing sculpture unless you want to. You're absolutely welcome to bring something else into this, but we're mostly going to be doing drawing and painting. What does sculpture in the expanded field have to do with our class? Well, we can look at the way that they sort of expanded outside the frame of what sculpture was for a contemporary trend that's happening now, which is drawing in the expanded field. And what it's basically proposing is you can take all of these different realms of knowledge and realms of creating artwork and have them overlap and allow them to be expressed in different ways. So what happens, with that previous piece, we had a sculpture that was a landscape that was part performative with the water that would leave and come to the piece. And all of these things were sort of coming together like a Venn diagram, creating something gray in the middle that was really exciting. So the idea is that practice is not defined in relation to any given medium, but rather in relation to the logical operations on a set of cultural terms for which any medium might be used. What does this mean? It means that we're looking at what drawing is in its most pure essence. It's a line. Drawing is a line. Drawing is rendering tone, value, shade, line, direction. But does that have to be pen on paper? And so what happens when we allow all of these different realms of creation to start to overlap and to start to create interesting ways of re-seeing some traditional ways of making that we've done before? This is a really interesting piece by an artist named Lynn Carter. She's a sculptor in Toronto, and she is a textile artist as well. So she's making this piece that sort of looks like a shadow, kind of like an ink blot that's coming off from the chair. And it's actually two sewn pieces. So it's a textile piece that lays on the ground, but it's also slightly graphic. It seems almost like a drawing of ink that's spilled out from under that chair. And so this is another instance where these kind of different realms are all sort of overlapping together. Here's some other examples of some of her pieces existing in the space and then taking up space on the floor. She also played with this work in her recent exhibition, where is this a painting? Is this a sculpture? So you have stretched canvas, you have charcoal and paint on that stretched canvas. The canvas is on a frame, but what happens when instead of having the frame on the wall, you turn it 90 degrees and now it's sticking out of the wall? Just that slight turn brings it into that gray zone between something sculptural coming out into the space and then the traditional means of painting of stretched canvas on a frame. This is another artist, Jamie Angelopoulos. She is also sort of a Toronto and Montreal based artist. I think right now she is represented by Parisian Laundry. She's had a couple solo shows there, but she does this really interesting sort of side-by-side practice of these beautiful giant drawings and paintings and these sculptural forms that sort of replicate these kind of abstracted forms in her drawing practice. So you can see this was the basement exhibition at Parisian Laundry. So they have that beautiful basement space that they exhibit works in. And she has these huge painting drawing pieces, two-dimensional pieces that have this really strong black line throughout each of those works. And then in the space, sort of playing in that space again, we have some of those same formal decisions, like that thick black line is existing and creating these different forms and looking like a drawn line or a gesture, looking like the lines layering on top of each other. You know, even the bases of those pieces to be sort of square and angular, replicating that kind of sense with the frames. They're working together somehow. They have less of a separation here and more of a kind of partnership and teamwork in this exhibition. So these are two pieces by another Montreal artist. His name is Michael Robinson, and he created sculptures for drawing. So he has both a drawing and a sculpture practice, but he was playing with this idea as well of drawing in the expanded field, sculpture in the expanded field. What if sculpture becomes drawing? What if drawing is a sculpture? And so you can see in his piece Square Root, like this really looks like a sketch, right? It looks like kind of a perspective drawing, just a few external black lines. The sculpture for drawing piece with metal clothes, drying supports and woods really looks like sort of this cross hatch image, but it's in three-dimensional space. A few more examples. Alexandra Birkin's Unit 3 detail. So what is it to have segments of color, pools of color existing within a frame, but in the 3D space, but somewhat on a flat plane? So playing with sort of painting and sculpture again. This piece by Bruce Tappala, Paintings for Germans, Sculpture for Snobs, using sort of installation elements and photography. Sarah Kate Wilson's projected painting, so using acetate with all of these drawings in color and then layering them and moving them and changing them and creating this sort of projected painting on the wall. Or this piece, which is really entertaining, Analia Saban's The Painting Ball, which is composed of 48 abstracts, 42 landscapes, 23 still lives, 11 portraits, 2 religious, and 1 nude, which taking the canvas of each of those drawings and ripping it, tying it into a rope, and spinning it like a ball of yarn, you know, it is composed of those paintings. And yet now it's this really strange sort of larger than life object. Bill Jenkins' bed with rope and fence. So this looks like a really beautiful kind of textural drawing piece, but it's actually three-dimensional coming out of the wall, and yet it's set on the wall where like a drawing and two-dimensional piece would be. So let's talk goals of the course. The hope for this course is to establish exercises for novel creation. I want you to keep things simple and non-precious. And I know that sometimes it can be really difficult when you think that you have an idea or you need a really good idea. Maybe you just finished a really good project and you're like, what's gonna come next? What's my next great idea? And there's a lot of pressure, I feel, to have that next great idea. But instead of putting all that pressure on yourself, I think easing into it, having a sort of practice that helps you to see what you're doing from the outside, because you just have so much around you that you can't help but notice some trends or things that are coming out into your art practice. And that requires no pressure. That requires kind of enjoying and relaxing in your practice. And finally, be inspired by each other and other artists. One of the best things that happened when I started the daily art practice exercises was I was able to riff off of other artists, see what they were doing, get inspired by their method of making. You know, things that seem so obvious to me are novel for someone else the same way, and it goes vice versa. So it's really important to have a community of artists to sort of share these ideas with and help them log in their minds as well other ways of seeing visual media. So this was a bit of a lecture. It will not be like this for the duration of our class. I just wanted to introduce the idea and give you a little bit of a foundation to like build up off of and to understand where this course is coming from. But we will start every class with a session of 30-minute drawings, 3 minutes per drawing. So 30 minutes and 3 minutes per drawing, it's 10 drawings. And you're welcome to do it any way that you want. It could be 10 separate sheets of paper. It could be 10 drawings on a singular piece of paper. It could be 10 separate singular objects. It could be 10 full compositions. Maybe you want to use watercolor like I was using. Maybe you want to use markers, pens, pencils, pastels. We had someone suggest in the last class, can I do writing? Absolutely. Whatever you want to do, you have 3 minutes per, and we're going to do it for a solid 30 minutes at the beginning of each class. Now, for those of you who missed week 1, the second thing that we did was drawing from words. So it's just an exercise that you can absolutely do with other friends, with your art community. It helps to kind of reinvigorate things. But essentially how it went was everyone gave 4 words. We picked about 4 of them from a hat randomly, and then we all created a drawing based on those 4 words. And in the end, we shared it. And what's really nice about that is you have the same setup, you have the same 4 words, but the way that people take it and how they create their work from that is always going to be unique and interesting. So I think the 4 words we had at the time for first class were ginger, discovery, muddy, and open. And the results were fantastic. So we won't do that exercise again, but just to give you a sense, every single class we will have some new form of exercise, some new kind of activity to have a new way of looking at your work, approaching your work, and then we'll share and we'll discuss. With that, I gave optional homework to do 1 drawing a day. You don't have to do it. You're absolutely welcome to. But if you do, it's wonderful if you want to bring it up in class and let us know. So that was my presentation. I'll just stop sharing there now. I hope that this helps to just get everyone kind of up to speed. In the second class, I will be sharing a course syllabus that will say sort of the theme of every week, moving from week 2 to week 8. The more people, the merrier. So please feel free to join us with whatever kinds of means of making that you'd like. I really look forward to meeting you. And if you have any questions at all, you can always email me at breanna.shanahan@live.ca. Hope to see you soon.